Congress passes legislation to assist the transit process for Tibetan refugees crossing the border, provide democracy and development support for the Tibetan community in Dharamsala, including the Tibetan government in exile, provide development grants to preserve cultural traditions and environmental conservation for Tibetans, and fully fund a series of initiatives related to education, the National Endowment for Democracy, the Tibetan language broadcast by Radio Free Asia and Voice of America that have so much excellent first-hand reporting on the ground. Again, these are institutions that have been set up that continue on and that are sustainable over time, In 2007, the U.S. Congress awarded the Congressional Gold Medal to His Holiness the Dalai Lama. The photos that I think many of you have probably seen of President George W. Bush and Speaker Nancy Pelosi in the Grand Rotunda of the U.S. Capitol really sent the strongest possible message of U.S. support for Tibet. And then, in 2016, Congress passed Chairman McGovern's Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act, which holds accountable government officials who are responsible for human rights abuses and corruption. And then in 2018, as we've talked about most recently, Congress passed the Reciprocal Access to Tibet Act that says if American journalists, diplomats, and tourists can't travel to Tibet, that Chinese officials shouldn't be allowed to travel freely in the United States. And that legislation reaffirms a basic principle of reciprocity in international relations. Now, implementation is a challenge, and support in Congress and supporters in Congress are going to be working very closely over the next few months to make sure this is implemented in the way that members of Congress intended. The legislation requires the State Department to report to Congress on the level of access that U.S. diplomats, journalists, and American citizens are granted to Tibetan areas of China. And then the second part of it is to provide a list of the Chinese officials who formulate or execute policies to restrict access to Tibet, who are then going to be ineligible to receive a visa or be admitted to the United States. Robust implementation will send a strong message both to Beijing and the international community that the Chinese government's discriminatory practices regarding access to Tibet will not be tolerated. And this is the first standalone bill that's ever passed the U.S. Congress on Tibet, and really it's a great victory for Tibetan supporters. Chairman McGovern and many members of Congress believe that for too long, Democratic and Republican administrations have not done enough to hold China accountable for human rights, and that Congress needs to step up the pressure, and this bill will certainly do that. Congress and the administration, the dynamic between the executive and legislative branches on China and Tibet is a challenge that needs to be carefully navigated. I've worked on both sides now, and I kind of see some of the differences and how each side can be more effective. In short, Congress has been the leader on the promotion of human rights, and certainly on China. Both Republicans and Democrats have worked together in bipartisan ways to advance these key initiatives. And I think that's partially because Congress is closer to the American people than the executive branch and closer to the advocates. And it also only takes a couple of the 535 legislators to lead. And when you have a couple of those that are really strong leaders that are willing to advance these issues, they're more independent actors, members of Congress are, than diplomats, and they can be more effective. And fortunately, we've had some great champions over the years, whether it's Speaker Nancy Pelosi or Chairman Jim McGovern or the late Tom Lantos, who was just a champion on every human rights issue you can think of. In the executive branch, officials are not independent actors, and diplomats have to weigh all the different foreign policy concerns, including good relations, before they can advance certain other issues. In recent years, I would argue that Congress has been a lot less risk-averse and more independent when it comes to promotion of democracy and human rights than the administrations, both Republicans and Democrats. That said, there's been a fundamental shift in Washington about how we should be engaging with China. The U.S. business community, the defense sector, workers, environment, human rights advocates, all seem to be coming together with a consensus that was also in President Trump's national security strategy, that the U.S. is in a strategic competition with China. Now, that means different things to different people, but one important principle that stands out has to do with reciprocity. And it's a principle of fairness, that we hold each other to the same standards. And I'm told this principle translates well across cultures and languages on just a basic principle of fairness. And many in the US believe that the principle of reciprocity should govern not only trade and economic issues, but also on human rights, access, and relations between our countries. And we think this is a good way to frame the issues, the issues that we're here to work on, and also other issues in US-China or China's relations with the world. In the House of Representatives this week, there's ongoing, as of, I guess it's in the middle of the night there, but in this morning, there'll be a series of 5 hearings on China in the House Foreign Affairs Committee. There's a major hearing about the overall US-China relationship, and there will be 4 other hearings based on China's relations with different parts of the world and all the issues on trade, human rights, security, the environment. And we believe that there will be a number of follow-up, a lot of legislative items, and a lot of innovative ideas will come out of those hearings. We have a new majority in the House of Representatives led by Speaker Pelosi, and we have a real opportunity to advance some new thinking about how we deal with China, and certainly how we advance the cause of Tibet. So where do we go from here? Moving forward, the U.S. will continue to effectively implement the legislative initiatives and provide a bedrock of support for the Tibetan cause. But there are some significant challenges ahead that really need global support. Speaker Pelosi and Chairman McGovern suggest that 2 legislative initiatives that we hope will be included in the declaration and the action plan that will be included for this convention. First, we are asking that all world parliamentarians and advocates in attendance here consider passing or advancing your own versions of the Reciprocity Access for Tibet Act to promote access to Tibet by diplomats, journalists, tourists, and others. Second, we're asking for parliaments to pass their own global Magnitsky Act. It's my understanding that many of your governments have done this already, including Latvia, and so if your countries and your governments and your supporters have done this already, thank you for that outstanding leadership. And in the United States, Chairman McGovern, who's the author of both of these bills, we'd be happy to assist, answer any questions, or work with you and continue the ongoing communication to advance these important initiatives. And then last, members of the U.S. Congress, including the China Commission, believe it's important for parliaments and governments to make strong, clear, and unequivocal statements on the decision regarding the Dalai Lama's succession or reincarnation, that it must be reserved for the current Dalai Lama, Tibetan Buddhists, and the Tibetan people. The international community really needs to get out front and cannot allow the Chinese government any credibility on this issue, especially when there's a known track record in the detainment of the 11th Panchen Lama. There are many other issues that we are going to be considering related to the opening of consulates, U.S. consulates in Lhasa, beginning a genuine dialogue with the Chinese government, the release of political prisoners, climate change, environmental protection, the role of the private sector in China, and academic freedom, just to name a few. As you well know, the situation is grim in Tibet. We have to be prepared to pursue new and innovative ideas for the Tibetan people. I hope these are some ideas that we've been working on in the United States. We are more than open to new ideas, but I think that when it comes to parliaments of the world, the representatives of free people everywhere, this is the real moment where we can come together and support the cause of Tibet. So, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan. You were less than 15 minutes, but you gave a lot of information, and I think it is very fitting that you are followed by Carl Gershman. Carl Gershman is the president of the National Endowment for Democracy. I was just thinking that you are probably my oldest friend in Washington, D.C. as well, and we have another, like Lodi Gyari said that he was his oldest friend in Washington, D.C., and I went to Washington, I was quite young, but Carl is really a legend in Washington, D.C. for all activists and dissidents who are working all over the world on human rights. The National Endowment for Democracy was also established by Congress as the China Commission, and it supports a variety of groups all over the world who work on democracy promotion. And Carl has been at the helm of the organization for a number of years, and Tibet has always been at the center of his work. So we take this opportunity also to thank you for that, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matteo. Great to be here with the Sikong and everyone. The reason, as you know, Matteo, that Lodi called me his oldest friend was that when he came to Washington in 1990, he had been told by George Fernandez, who I happened to know from, I was representing a U.S. group that was a member of the Socialist International, and I knew George from there, and George, when Lodi was coming, he said, look him up. So that's how that happened, and it just so happens that just in the past months, both Lodi and George Fernandez passed away. Lodi in October, and George in January. And just 1 month ago in New Delhi, there was a memorial meeting for both Lodi and George together. And the Deputy Speaker, Punsak, I think, told me that he spoke at that event. And you did too, right. So, I mean, it's quite extraordinary. And so I think at this meeting, it's appropriate to say something about Lodi and George. And I just want to note that at that meeting that was in New Delhi, both of them were called two great champions of democracy and Tibetan freedom, and they were called great souls who lived for the cause of humanity, democracy, and freedom, and they were indeed that. They were heroes of democracy together. And it's important to understand them, and I count myself among those here today who knew and admired both of them, and I believe that we would do well to think about the standard that they set as we consider how we need to respond to the continuing and worsening oppression of the people of Tibet. Lodi and George shared a passion for democracy and justice. They each regarded the Tibet cause as a critical focal point in the global struggle for freedom. And I think that's really true given the strategic location. We heard a lot about that here. They were both very smart and strategic. They were politically astute and focused on Tibet, yet also universalist in their vision and in their commitment. Most of all, they were fighters, really freedom fighters, to be precise, who were driven by core moral values and deep democratic convictions. About 5 years ago, Lodi shared with me a letter that he had written to George in 1977. George, for those of you who don't know this, had just really helped lead the resistance in India to Indira Gandhi's emergency, which suspended democratic rights and practices in India for a year and a half. It was a tremendous setback for democracy globally, and George was a real radical and a fighter, and he led the resistance.